It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster where later today Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will address MPs in the House of Commons. Joining me today, Conservative MP Laura Trott, SNP Defence spokesman Stuart MacDonald, former Downing Street Press Secretary Alistair Campbell, and the former Conservative government advisor Salma Shah. Today, does sending fighter jets from Poland to help Ukraine defend itself risk reprisals from Russia?
Russia could retaliate, and so it really has to be their decision. We'll stand by them, whatever the decision that is.
Petrol prices head towards £1.70 a litre. Is it time to drill for more of our own oil and gas?
There is a crunch on at the moment. We need to intensify our self-reliance as a transition with more hydrocarbons.
And desperate refugees flee the fighting. Why has Britain only taken 300 so far? We'll also hear from this model and activist about the impact of body image on mental health. Hello. Well, we'll start, of course, with events in Ukraine. And as we've just heard, there is a discussion underway now about whether or not the military help being offered by the West should be increased further. There is discussion about whether Poland should provide some of its old aircraft to Ukrainian fighters as they try and bomb and defeat the Russian forces. As we've just heard, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, said that this was clearly not a risk-free thing to do, but it was something worth discussing. Laura, what do you think about this?
Well, I think that Ben Wallace was quite clear this morning that this is Poland's decision as to whether they do this or not, and that we will support them whatever happens. As NATO allies, that's our obligation. But I think everything in this conflict, we never know what's going to happen next week. So I think we need to be on alert, we need to be ready, and we need to stand by our allies. But
Poland says this has to be part of a NATO decision. They're not going to do this alone. So, should this be something that NATO considers?
Well, I think that we've been clear that we'll support them whatever they decide, but this has to be a sovereign decision. Stuart,
you're the defence spokesman. Is this something that you would be comfortable seeing as a further ratchet of the West's military support for Ukraine?
Well, I've always supported the government in terms of the military support that it's given to Ukraine, and it was always obvious that was going to have to deepen. In terms of the decision with regards to Poland, I agree with Laura, it's a decision for Poland, and naturally consultations will take place amongst NATO defence ministers, but it's right that we stand by Ukraine. It's the front line of the fight for democracy, and to back away from further military support at this time, I think, would be an error on our part.
I mean, Alistair, Vladimir Putin has said from the beginning, stay away, West, this is not your conflict. I mean, how do you think he might react if he sees Polish planes, repainted, of course, in a Ukrainian insignia, flying to bomb his own troops? I mean, this risks an escalation.
I mean, I think what this goes to is the fundamental question, which I think the Ukrainians have already decided as to whether we are already in some kind of bigger conflict with Putin or not. They think we are. I think whatever Zelensky says today, I suspect he will make that clear that he actually doesn't think that the West and NATO is going far enough. Now, it is dangerous. There's no doubt about that at all. But I think I felt very uncomfortable hearing Ben Wallace saying that this is a decision for Poland, because it's a decision for Poland with implications for all of us. And I think we should be engaged in that discussion. And one of the problems I have with the way that this whole thing has gone, and by the way, this predates this crisis, it goes back, you could argue, 2 decades, is that Putin, after the first few years, it was clear that he only understands and appreciates the language of strength. That's clear in all of his dealings right across the board. And I think there's been a real problem on this, the extent to which every time he makes a threat, every time he makes a noise, our reaction always seems to be, well, don't worry, we're not going to react to that. And I think that risks signalling weakness to him, and that's what he exploits. And so I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we have World War III. I really am not. But I think that there's just got to be, I think, an understanding that we're maybe further into this than we like to think already. And I'd be if you're the Polish government, you're sitting there thinking, is this really a decision we're making on our own? I think that's quite a difficult place for them to be.
Salma, what do you think? I mean, Western leaders have been praising the courage of Ukrainian fighters while clearly ratcheting up quite quickly the military support they're giving them. At what point does this become something which we are, as Alistair said, directly involved in ourselves, almost sort of accidentally?
Yeah, well, I actually concur with Alistair's analysis, and I think one of the difficulties, and I appreciate that none of the politicians on the panel were able to give us, anything deeper than what they've said already, is that strategically, if we have that break and we start saying, well, this is Poland's sovereign decision, then at what point do other countries decide that they're actually going to break away from this alliance that's been created? And if we're going to have this strength in this bloc that is the West, then we really do need to try and take these decisions together, or at least understand strategically where are the red lines that we're not going to cross. Now, I imagine there's discussions that are happening about that, on that military strategy internally. But the idea that Poland is going to have to sit there and sort of take this risk, I don't think is going to last.
Sure. Do you think there's been enough debate here politically within Parliament about how this is escalating and how our involvement is deepening almost by the day?
Well, look, one of the problems, I think, with the way we've been discussing Ukraine in the past fortnight is that people seem to think this war only started a fortnight ago. It started in 2014. Prior to the current wave, 13,000 Ukrainians are already dead, almost 2 million displaced internally. But I think it's one thing to say Poland will make the decision, and I think you're right to say that the idea we leave them to make that decision would be wrong, but they won't be making that decision without consultation with NATO ministers. They won't. Also, remember, I think about 6 weeks ago, the UK government announced the new trilateral security arrangements with Poland and Ukraine. So they will come to a decision, but it will be informed, I'm quite sure, with several conversations, including with the United Kingdom and other NATO member states. But given all that we have invested in Ukraine over the years, Operation Orbital, the political, the economic support, and the support that will need to come, that country will need to be rebuilt with our help at some point in the future. I just think it would be a mistake on our part to somehow step away from further military support. If we want to avoid ourselves all being dragged into World War III, I think we have to keep it at the rate we are supporting them now, deepen the economic support, and I'm sure we'll come to the discussion on refugees as well. It's
very hard to know how Vladimir Putin will respond to any of this stuff. I was interested that Mark Rutte yesterday, the Dutch Prime Minister who was in London, said we can only guess as the West what his next move might be. I think, Alistair, you're the only one around this table who's met the man, haven't you, when you were working for Tony Blair? I mean, what was he like? I mean, from what you know about him and your dealings with him, take us into his mind as best you can.
Well, I couldn't take you into his mind of today, I don't think, because I think he's gone through various phases. And when we first met him, which was before he became president, and I can remember, Tony Blair's initial response was actually quite positive. He felt he was Yeltsin's chosen successor. He felt quite progressive. He was very inquisitive. He was quite quiet, quite timid. I think there was a turn after 9/11 and particularly after Afghanistan. And I think what happened was that he started to feel his own power. I wonder whether he didn't at some point decide that reform was actually just too hard and the attractions of the kleptocracy were too great. And look, there's a reason why most countries have limits, or a lot of countries have limits on the amount of time somebody can stay with real power. That's that it does stuff to you. And I think he has become, I don't buy this idea that he's unhinged, I don't buy this idea that he's crazy. I think actually, no, I think what he's doing, if you track back through some of the incidents that Stuart's talking about, if you track back, it kind of is all of a piece with this idea of, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst thing that ever happened, the greater Russia, that we're misunderstood, that we're victimized by the rest of the world. But I think it's very, very hard to work out what he will be thinking because he's so isolated even within his own circle. I mean, when you watch those pictures at the end of the ridiculous table with the people who are meant to be his key people, even the guys with uniforms on, they look terrified. And that is a guy who I think is not necessarily that he's unhinged, but I think that the sense of him feeling that power. And my worry about him is that we keep thinking that he won't go quite as far as we thought he might. I think that's a mistake to think like that. Because, and I go back to the point I made earlier, he only understands and fears strength, nothing else.
I wonder what is more dangerous for the West, I guess, as this crisis unfolds, a victorious Vladimir Putin who gets sort of what he wants in Ukraine, despite the horrific cost, or a weakened Vladimir Putin who's on the ropes and feels cornered? What do you think, Laura?
Well, I think both feel very dangerous to me right now. But I mean, to go back to Alice's point, I think where Putin's been inconsistent, we must be consistent. And we have said that we are not going to intervene militarily unless he goes after NATO allies. But we will supply lethal aid, we will impose severe economic sanctions, and we will make sure that the access to his the sea defence, those are things that cut off as much as we can. And I think that's what is really important here. We must be clear to him where our red lines are and then act on them, because otherwise this has a potential to escalate very, very quickly.
Can I say, by the way, I think that's incredibly important about the red lines. I think one of the reasons we're in this mess is because in previous occasions when red lines are being crossed, not least in Syria, the world has not reacted as it said it would. And I think that is what has made Putin think he can get away with a lot more than maybe we think.
Well, one aspect of this crisis that clearly has rattled Western nerves is Vladimir Putin talking fairly explicitly about the fact he has nuclear weapons and suggesting that he may possibly be prepared to use them. Let's have a quick look at yesterday's front page of the national newspaper. SNP chief, Trident must go. Stuart, your party has long said that you don't want the nuclear deterrence. You'd get British nuclear weapons out of Scotland if you ever got independence. Has this crisis changed your mind at all about that?
I think the crisis is going to cause a lot of us, and it's important we don't rush this, but it's going to cause a lot of us to have to reassess the various bits of our defence and security posture we have as parties that nation states have. But on nuclear weapons, our position remains the same. In fact, I think the crisis has somewhat reinforced it, to be honest. The only way to get the nuclear weapons removed from where they currently are and transferred is with independence. I accept the reality of the makeup of the British Parliament. It's unlikely to happen via that route. But who can honestly put their hands up and say they feel safer now with these types of threats coming from the Kremlin with nuclear weapons?
I do. I feel a lot safer because of our nuclear weapons. I really do. I thank God for them. I mean, you look. Do we think that this would have happened to Ukraine if they had nuclear weapons?
Would it have changed the West's response to this crisis, though, if nuclear weapons weren't in the equation?
Of course it would. It's what's preventing the West from getting involved any more than it is at the minute. It's nuclear weapons that are stopping us going in with a no-fly zone, humanitarian corridors, whatever it is you want to call it, explicitly. That's the only thing that stands between us and doing more to help those people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine.
No, because we don't want to go to war with Russia.
Because it's a nuclear weapon state.
But
I mean, I think not for me to speak for the British government, but I think they'd also argue that they don't want conventional warfare.
Absolutely.
Salma.
Well, all I was going to say is that the whole idea of the deterrent is that, if what Alice is saying is right, and I tend to agree that, Putin is a lot more calculated and he's not unhinged, actually he does understand that we can retaliate and that other nuclear powers can retaliate. So as much as we don't like the idea of nuclear weapons and we know that the harm that they do, having it is better than not having it. And I feel better as a consequence.
It's stopping us, helping more now. He knows, he's calculated, we're not going to get involved because of this issue, explicitly this issue.
So he's using it as a deterrent?
I think it's deterring us from doing the right thing. So, this doesn't work.
But it's also deterring him from doing the wrong thing.
But in terms of independence, I mean, is anyone really suggesting that a small state like Scotland would be a nuclear power? It's worth remembering the Ukraine situation. They weren't actually Ukraine's weapons. They were the successor states, as they will be in the case of Scottish independence.
And they gave them up as part of a deal, which they may now...
Well, they didn't. They weren't theirs to give up.
But the SNP would like the protection of NATO if you get independence. So you're happy for the British and the French and the Americans to protect Scotland under the NATO umbrella?
Look, what we've done is we've assessed if Scotland were to become independent, what is our best security posture? What's in our interest, the rest of the UK's interest as a fellow partner and ally, and in NATO's interest? The clue's in the name. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. We're a North Atlantic country. We can't change geography. And on balance, we think it's best, yes, to be a contributing partner to NATO. Now, does that mean that we want to host the UK's nuclear deterrent? No. And by the way, I rather suspect London wouldn't want to have its weapons in a foreign state, albeit a friendly neighbouring state. That's not going to be in the UK's interest either. So we will transfer those weapons via negotiation, safety right at the top of the agenda. And the other thing as well, I would say, is how we handle this is going to be set the background music to so much else, getting into NATO, European Union membership, the types of relationships that we will develop across the world. So we will handle it in a responsible way, in a timely way, and in a way that reflects opinion in Scotland, which is both pro-NATO and anti-hosting the nuclear weapons. So I think our policy is consistent with actually most NATO member states.
Laura, it's a big headache, isn't it, as we head towards a possible referendum in Scotland on independence, what to do about Faslane, nuclear weapons, the Trident defence, which is there on the Clyde?
I mean, I would like a united kingdom. I think this conversation is exactly why Scottish independence is a terrible idea for many, many reasons, but one of which is the defence of our nation, which has been held together by nuclear weapons, which do, I think, act as a deterrent. I think what we've seen in Ukraine is they are effective in doing so, and that I think that it's something that should be maintained and is very, very important for us as a nation.
Go on, Alice.
I just wanted to make the point, I think when we talk about nuclear weapons, I think here in Britain, maybe in America, we're thinking about literally weapons of mass destruction. I think the Russians are far more focused, I think, if they are going to use nuclear weapons, on battlefield nuclear weapons, and it's very much more integrated into their thinking. And don't forget, he's not been averse already to using polonium to kill some of the people he doesn't.
Let's have a quick look at let's have a look at this tweet here by a former Russian foreign minister. This was, I think, posted yesterday. Andrei Kozyrev, and he said loads of discussion about the threat of nuclear war from the Kremlin and whether Putin is rational. I share my thoughts in this thread. He does not believe Russia would use nuclear weapons and believe Putin is a rational actor. That's what we were just talking about. But as you said, Alistair, there is clearly concern that within the Russian military handbook there is a provision, and perhaps it's a lower bar than the West would have, for using what are called tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. And if, nobody knows, if that happened, what on earth would the West and NATO do?
Very, very big question. And I think that's the question that Ben Wallace was, in a way, trying to push away. And I understand why they're trying to push that question away. But I do hope that Stuart's right, that at the NATO level, those discussions are going on, because I think we could be closer to some of these questions than we think. If you just
really,
well, just look at the way this thing has gone. It's not that long ago. Stuart was saying last time he was in Kiev, they were all saying he's not going to do the full invasion. He's not going to go the full hog. He's gone the full hog. We see this terrible stuff happening now. 2 million people crossing the border, getting out, and they're bogged down. They'll calm down. I don't often say this. I agreed with Boris Johnson yesterday when he said that Putin's doubling down. He's doubling down. Now, double down, double down, double down. We've got to be very realistic, I think. It's not a question of scaring people. I think we've just got to understand we're dealing with somebody who's been there 22 years. We're dealing with somebody who's got a genuine sense of grievous, justified or not, and we know it's not, but it's a genuine sense of grievous. He's got an awful lot of power, and he now knows he's made an awful lot of enemies around the world. And I just think we should be realistic about the threat that we face. So I agree with most of what he's saying there.
Well, that is chilling stuff, isn't it, Laura? I mean, everything about this is extraordinary and terrible, and the speed with which it has brought the West together, it has made a pariah of Russia. But for younger people, suddenly this question of nuclear weapons, which they've never thought about, is everywhere in the papers, and dealing with threats that they've never had to think about before.
It's incredibly difficult. I think the thing that I find solace in is the reaction of the West, though. I mean, what I think Putin was hoping for was disunity, and what he's seen is unity and actually quite unflinching resolve, which I think we can all take some solace from. And I think that the United Nations, there was a vote, 141 nations, voted to condemn the action in Ukraine. This has unified the world in a way which I think would have been unexpected for him and makes things very difficult. I think the question of where this goes next and how he responds to that unity is going to be the thing that we're going to have to grapple with now. But I hope that the difficulties that he's encountering, plus the very clear lines that have been set out for him about this conflict, will mean that we can hopefully at some stage de-escalate this. But I know that's unfortunately probably quite far along the line.
I think the problem is, Putin needs a ladder to climb down, and what's that actually going to look like, apart from the totalling? Apart from the totalling of Kiev, as far as he's concerned, he needs to show a victory. And I totally agree with Laura's point about the unity of the international community. But at what point does that start to split and break away? Because it is these questions about what happens if he does start using tactical weapons. happens. And also, I would just say at the UN General Assembly, we are actually seeing a bit of a break as well, which makes me nervous when you think about what Imran Khan said about and Pakistan and sort of, you know, what India's done. And we, of course, know China's position. So we have to make sure that actually what we're not going to see are other grievances against the West actually becoming some kind of catalyst for people to start joining Putin's cause.
And I also think there's a real danger at the moment of the kind of new dividing line. It's not going to be left-right. It's not going to be Cold War built. It's sort of democracy dictatorship.
Right.
And I think that's a real thing. The thing that really disappointed me on the kind of diplomatic side was the sense of the Indians basically just sitting it out in the way that we're used to the Chinese doing. So I think it's very easy to feel the unity here today, and we're clearly going to feel it when you see Zelensky in the UK Parliament. But I think the picture around the world is a little more complex.
Well, the shelling of Ukrainian cities and towns is, of course, driving a huge exodus of refugees from the country. The UN reckons 1.7 million people have already left, and that number is clearly going to grow. And the UK's response is certainly in the spotlight at the moment. This is what the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace had to say about that this morning.
We could do more to make that processing much, much quicker. There are currently 17,000 people who've started that process, and I think we will, absolutely do more to make it quicker.
Ben Wallace. Well, we can now be joined by the BBC's home editor, Mark Easton, who is in Calais for us, where we know that hundreds of Ukrainians trying to get to the UK are there, trying to get hold of visas that might be able to get them over to Britain. Mark, what are you seeing there this morning?
Well, morning, Ben. Well, as you say, around 600 Ukrainian refugees still here in Calais, the vast majority of those trying to make that short crossing across the channel. They can literally see the white cliffs of Dover on the horizon. And yet the Home Office has made it quite clear that they will not be able to get the visas that they need to make that journey on the ferry or in the tunnel here in Calais. There was a lot of talk, you may remember, about a surge team from the Home Office offering support to any of the Ukrainian refugees who made it to Calais. But that, I'm now told, did not mean that they would be able to get their visas here, despite what many of the refugees had thought. Instead, they're being told that they must go to either Paris or to Brussels. This morning, however, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss revealed that the Home Office is actually about to open a new VAC, Visa Application Centre, in Lille, which is sort of 60 miles southeast of Calais. It's hardly handy for the hundreds of refugees who are already here, but obviously for those who perhaps haven't reached Calais yet, and we are expecting many more to try and make that journey, it could be somewhere that they could go through on their way to Calais. And I think that is the thinking from the Home Office. Meanwhile, here in Calais, the authorities are being actually increasingly critical themselves of the British response and saying that the UK authorities really should be doing more to support the refugees here. The mayor of Calais, I was speaking to her just now, she said that she wants to see an end to visas. She thinks that the Ukrainians here should not have to go through this laborious paperwork and should be allowed to go straight on board, and these things can be sorted out later. She's also called for a proper team of officials from the UK to be here to provide visa support and so on. And she contrasted the British response to that of the people of her city, saying that many families have used a scheme here in France to take in Ukrainian refugees. These are families in Calais who've said, look, come and stay with us while you're here. Hoteliers have dropped their prices for Ukrainians, some places allowing them to stay for nothing. And also the train fare from Calais to Paris, if that's where people want to go to try and finalise their British bureaucratic visa paperwork, the French are prepared to pay for the return ticket to Paris. So a significant contrast, and I'm sure the politics won't be lost on anyone, with the French kind of saying, look, the British have shown that they need to do more before, and they certainly need to be doing more now.
Mark, that's really helpful. Thanks very much indeed for joining us from a very sunny Calais this morning. Laura, what did you make of that? There's clearly a degree of chaos and frustration on the French side of the Channel that the British effort to help these refugees is not up to scratch at the moment.
Well, we've got two big schemes in place. We've got the family reunification visa and then the humanitarian visa. And what we've decided to do is to have biometric testing, so we know who's coming into the country before people are granted a visa. Now, the issue at the moment is around getting access to those checks for those biometric passes. Now, that is happening. I'm seeing it in my own constituency. I've got two particular cases. One has now thankfully gone through. The other one we're still waiting. And we need to do more in terms of access to those checks. I mean, the debate is around whether we still need those checks or not. And this is obviously incredibly difficult because you want to be generous and let everybody in. But at the same time, from a national security perspective, I do think it is very important that we know who's coming into this country. So it's how to weigh those two things up. But I completely agree that we need to have more access to these appointments. And I know that the Home Office is working on that.
Well, in terms of just the technicalities of how the current system is working, I mean, several of your colleagues have been quite critical about this. Let's look at a tweet from Victoria MP Simon Hoare, who said 300 approved, that's visas, against 17,700 applications started. It's simply not good enough or fast enough. Perhaps the visa approach is the wrong one, as it doesn't allow for humanitarian urgency. And that's the point, isn't it? There's how this is actually being dealt with in terms of the paperwork. But contrast it to the European Union, which has said every member of the EU will allow Ukrainian refugees in to stay for 3 years, to work and live without any visa requirement at all. The UK is the odd one out.
It is that strategic decision as to whether you decide whether you want to know who's coming into your country or not. And this is a very live and very valid debate.
I imagine Germany does and France does and other countries do as well.
I think Rosie Duffield was actually on your programme yesterday and she said that she agreed that we do need some checks before you come in. So I think there's a degree of cross-party unity in terms of the need for checks. I completely agree with you that we need to do more in terms of a widening access to that, because I think that's where this is falling short at the moment, and I think everyone agrees that it's falling short and that we need to do more.
I really think, by the way, I think that getting rid of DFID was a terrible mistake. I think this is exactly the sort of situation where DFID had a really good, the Department of International Development.
It's been fused with the Foreign Office.
Yeah, it has. And Liz Truss yesterday, when she was at the Select Committee, she did not give me the sense that this was right up the development and aid side of this was up there as a priority. And I really have a sense of there just not being joined up government on this. Priti Patel in the Commons yesterday, Liz Truss at the Select Committee, Boris Johnson when he was out and about doing his thing with Trudeau and Rutte. They were in different places saying different things, and there's no grip. And my worry, I'll be honest, Laura, my worry is that actually they're kind of getting the result that they want. They're talking the talk in terms of being welcoming, but actually they're making it as hard as they possibly can. And I see the same gap on dealing with the oligarchs. With the online crime bill last night was not nearly as strong. You guys voted for amendments that I think will help these oligarchs carry on getting away with it. And I think there's just a gap between the tough talk and the humanitarian, compassionate talk and what's actually happening.
Stuart, can I ask Stuart, what would your approach to this be? Would you just try and make the government's existing system better, or would you follow the EU's route and say no visas required?
So look, the Home Office has never seen a problem it didn't want to make worse, and that's just about the only thing it ever succeeds in is making things worse. I think what we need to do and do quickly...
Ask Salma about this, who used to work there.
Well, there we go. I think what we need to do and do quickly is match the EU offer. All this nonsense and bureaucracy we're putting in people's way. The reality is most refugees will probably stay in countries either bordering or near to Ukraine because they'll want to go back there, and that the government is correct. The security situation, you know, saying we national security risks or whatever, well, Latvia's got those, Ireland's got those, Germany's got those. You know, we all face the same issue here. So if we're going to remain united, and I have bent over backwards, and in fairness, it's not been that difficult on some of the other stuff, to be with the government on this in terms of, you know, defensive support, economic support, all the rest of it. The unity is important, but where the government is letting itself down and making it hard to maintain the unity is on this issue. And it just breaks my heart to see us standing out as the odd one out for all the wrong reasons yet again. We need to match the EU offer and do it now.
Salma, the government had a very long time to prepare for this crisis. You know, they thought the Russian invasion was possible. You used to work in the Home Office. Do you understand why there is a degree of confusion now?
I certainly understand why there's a degree of confusion, and I think that sort of delivery of this has been chaotic, and it is very hard with the way that the Home Office is structured to be able to deliver something well, I'm afraid to say. So, we've seen 17,000 applications. What I'm hoping is that as we get, through and we stand up the teams better, that we are going to get, more numbers coming through quickly, and the biometric testing is going to happen much more quickly. So we're going to see a real huge increase in those numbers. I think the problem is that actually the rhetoric has been disjointed, and I agree that there is a lack of grip and a lack of coordination. And I think if that improves, actually, we are going to see that the numbers increasing means that our offer is quite generous. I think there is a problem with the EU's offer in terms of the 3 years coming in, because the Home Office has recent experience of Windrush, where documentation has not worked. And I think they understand that actually if you're not bringing people in with the checks, with the right paperwork, that in a couple of years down the line, is that going to create bigger problems? So there are some actual practical reasons why I think that this is happening. But the offer is hopefully going to be more generous as soon as they start standing
essentially
up
because we can't trust the Home Office to get it right. These poor people have got to pay the price.
I think that's really unfair. Can I just say that's really unfair, because people who are working in the Home Office on the front line at the border are doing a really difficult job. And I'm not saying for a second that this isn't more chaotic than it needs to be, but I think we have to give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt that they are doing their best with the checks that are there.
And also, I also think it's very important, just to come back on Alistair very, very briefly, the government does have a good track record with Syria, with Afghanistan, with Hong Kong, in terms of welcoming people over here. And I think that the intention is entirely there.
We need to move on to another consequence of this conflict, which, of course, is spiralling energy prices. They'd already shot up before the invasion in Ukraine. But let's look at this story on the front page of today's Mail. New dash for gas to break Putin's grip. Boris Johnson suggesting strongly yesterday that further drilling in the North Sea is one way out of this. Laura, do you think the government should be approving new licences?
I think the key thing for this is preparing the British public that these sanctions are going to have impacts domestically as well as internationally. Of course, it's going to be nowhere near in terms of what others are experiencing, but they are going to have an impact. And we need to work to mitigate that as much as we can, and we should. But it is inevitable that it's going to be felt. And there is going to be some transitional difficulties which we need to work on. I was pleased to see that the Prime Minister said that there's going to be a new strategy which is going to be in place in the next couple of days. So I think we need to look at all options. I think it's important that we do focus on energy security. I think that's something that over decades we've perhaps not done as much as we should have done on this point, particularly around nuclear. So I think it's something that it's right that we need to focus on.
What about you? Do you think that these licences to tap gas and oil in the North Sea should be given? I mean, granted, it's going to take years to get the stuff out of the ground, even if it happens. So it's not going to help people in Ukraine now, and it won't necessarily put pressure on Vladimir Putin. But would you support it?
So, look, just in the same way we've seen over the past few days, people just call for a rise in defence spending. My worry is that we make the same rush in terms of drilling for more oil. I think what we need here is a proper assessment of how have we ended up in this situation. You're right on energy resilience, and how do we get out of it? And I worry that the reach just to shout drill, baby, drill becomes all too tempting. Something must be done. This is something, therefore we must do it. We do have a climate emergency going on. Scotland and the North Sea in particular has a role to play in that. Clearly, that is an industry in Scotland that is very important to our economy, very important to the northeast of Scotland in particular. We don't want to see people's jobs there jeopardised. But if we allow this crisis to knock us so far off focus in terms of dealing with the climate emergency, we won't be the winners at the end of that. The bills will still continue to go up. So I don't have a clear, easy answer on this. And I think anyone who pretends to right now is fibbing. I think we all need to take a step back and do this properly.
But they're not necessarily contradictory.
I heard Boris Johnson say he's going to bring forward a new energy supply strategy. I'm with Stuart on this. I worry that it's partly this is about Boris Johnson, the way that he governs and the way that he operates. But if you go back to the defence review, for example, that was meant to be a new strategy. And actually, you go and read it in the light of what's happening now, and those people who criticise them for not understanding the genuine threats that we faced and trying to make it all about some sort of post-Brexit global Britain, when there was more about Antarctica than there was about Russia. And I worry that the energy supply, likewise, it's a real problem for all European countries, this. But if can he please, or Laura, can you please try to get him genuinely to have an energy supply strategy, not just something that gets us through the next few weeks, because that's what I worry he's going to bring forward.
Well, I think that's what we recognise that we all need. And just on Stuart's point, I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between energy security and renewables, because obviously, renewables is, where we have a huge amount of potential in terms of our own energy security. But I think that this is highlighted something which has been a problem for a long period of time, but has now come to light, essentially.
The whole thing is highlighted so many things on the security side, on the economic side, on the strategic side, the environmental.
Yep.
We've been warned about this. This goes back to our time, by the way.
Salma, and this really, really adds another dimension to the cost of living crisis, doesn't it? That politicians, the Chancellor, Prime Minister have to deal with in the months ahead.
Hugely, and I think this is the sort of the terrible thing about the way that democracy works. And this is only one. Is that we have these 5-year terms, and the problem is that with 5-year terms, anything that you try and do, which is long-term and strategic, which might be 30 or 50 years.
He used to say
but
this.
He hasn't done anything particularly cleverly strategic apart from sort of bomb his neighbours. But it falls away, and people long grass it because they think it's not going to be their problem. And ultimately, whatever the strategy is that's set out, it's not going to come on stream for another 2 or 3 years, by which point, we don't know who's going to be in any of these jobs, we don't know what the government's going to look like, and that will probably fall away as well. So, actually, if we are going to make a commitment for this, there is going to have to be, cross-party agreement on what it is that we are going to do in the future. So something like an infrastructure commission that actually has some teeth, that is able to deliver some of these renewables or new nuclear or whatever.
We are going to leave Ukraine there for the moment and talk about something else, because the model and activist Naomi Nicholas-Williams has been giving evidence to MPs on the Health Select Committee this morning, including Laura, who was there. And she was talking about negative body image and its impact on mental health. And I'm pleased to say that she's with us now. Hello, Naomi.
Hello.
Hi. Well, look, thanks very much for joining us on the programme.
Pleasure.
What message did you deliver to MPs this morning?
I delivered that, body image is so much more than just vanity, and it's all about mental health as well. And there's a physical, effect on people as well that suffer with body image, and a lot needs to be changed regarding, how social media perpetuates that stigma around diet culture and such.
And for people who don't know very much about this, why does the issue matter so much, and how does it affect both physical and mental health?
Because we're in our bodies every day, and I feel like when there's constant, a barrage of a way you should look, or you being told you should look a certain way, it can affect you in a negative way. And I feel like with mental, it can be more, it can affect you more than just the physical, because it isn't just about vanity. And James and Alex touched on the fact that it's very much about a mental prison, so it can affect you mentally, and then you factor in the physical side of it, and you trying to constantly obtain a body standard that's unobtainable and isn't even real, so it can affect both, and it does.
And clearly social media has amplified this issue. What would you like social media companies to be doing and thinking about this question?
I think just the long-term outcome of how the stereotypes and the things and that it's perpetuating for younger people growing up, because our bodies do so much for us, and I think we should be focused more on what our bodies do for us rather than how they look. And I think that it's so focused on how we look at the minute, and that's perpetuating such a negative stereotype and connotation around how we should look, and that everyone should look a certain way. I think social media needs to do more against really making it more of an inclusive place for all bodies, and to just kind of push out the whole diet culture side of things.
Naomi, thanks very much for that. Stay with us, and I'll talk about some of that with the panel. Laura, you were there, and you heard what Naomi was talking about. What did you make of what she was saying?
Well, I thought it was incredibly important testimony that she gave to the Health and Social Care Committee this morning. And I think there's two fronts on which we need to act. There's the online safety bill, which is coming through, which we need to make sure does involve greater regulation for social media companies around these types of issues. But there's also action that we need to take, and I'm very pleased to say we are taking, around regulation of the cosmetic services industry. So things like Botox, fillers, who they're given to, and what the advice is that's given around those, because they are, preying on vulnerable people at the moment, and they're putting people in danger. So I'm very glad we're doing something about that too.
Alistair, you're a big campaigner on mental health issues. How big a deal is the body image question? do you think?
Well,
and what can government, what can companies do about it?
I think the first thing is, I was talking to Naomi outside, the first thing is to take it seriously. And even though, as you say, I've been campaigning on mental health for a long time, I didn't really have an understanding of just how seriously body dysmorphia needs to be taken until I got involved with a guy called Danny Gray, who founded this fantastic website called Just Ask a Question, JAAQ. And he has chronic body dysmorphia. It comes from when he was bullied at school and he had sticky out ears, and he then had an operation to fix them, and having learnt that he could look better and feel better, he's better most of the time now, but this sort of addiction to how he looks. And no matter how good he looks, he thinks everybody else thinks he looks terrible. And that's a mental health problem. And I was with him once when he kind of couldn't leave the room because he was just so convinced that he was just not looking right. And because it's the sort of the looking and the feeling going together. And I think there is a real danger with, I think people now understand that depression's real, OCD's real, anxiety is a real illness. I still think that with body dysmorphia, people think it's just some kind of thing about vanity. I think it's a genuine mental health problem which doesn't get the attention it deserves, which is why it's...
Yeah, Naomi, you were nodding away there.
Everything that was said was correct. I think that there's not enough focus on the mental side of how we see our body and what the media does and how it plays into that issue of body issues as such. So I think that, yeah, it's a very big thing, and mental health is a big part of that.
Salma, social media companies clearly have they're a platform for people posting pictures of themselves, their own ideas of their beauty, and I think that contributes, a lot to how people sometimes feel about their own bodies and when they look at those pictures. Is there anything more that could be done? I saw that one Conservative MP put forward a private member's bill earlier this year that said there should be some sort of tag on posts that sort of verified whether or not these images had been altered or not. I mean, is that something that could be done?
I think that's very important, and there was sort of a push a couple of years ago in advertising to sort of kite mark where there have been digital enhancements for photos, which I think give people a sense of reality. I think the other thing is, I mean, social media companies, there's so much nuance between them in terms of what they're used for. I mean, personally, I had to delete my Instagram because I just found it sort of endlessly false in terms of what people were portraying up there, and it just became a bit of a waste of time for me. But the thing that also, outside of what social media companies can do, I think there is a cultural problem with the way people react to you and what you look like if you're putting something up on social media. And people can be pretty cruel and quite rude. And I think what social media companies can do is be a little bit more generous in terms of who they kick off or who they punish on their platforms.
Briefly, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, all power to Naomi for raising the issue. I think she's right, Alistair's right. We need to accept this is a real issue for many people. On the Instagram point, the adverts I get are for shampoo that makes your bald patch grow back in, so that gives you an idea of where I'm coming from.
That's just yours.
You actually get the Agro ones.
Well, but look, it is. We all go to schools in our constituencies. We hear it from young people. So if we're all accepting it's real, we need to address it. We need to address it, whether that's social media companies, legislation, whatever it is. I would take my lead from Naomi and others on that. But all power to those who are raising the issue, absolutely.
Great, thank you. Well, I mean, help, of course, is available for people, and there are details of organisations offering information and support with mental health. They're available through the BBC, bbc.co.uk/action line, or you can call for free at any time to hear information on 0800 155 998. Naomi, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme and telling us about the issue and coming straight from Parliament to be on the programme. That's much appreciated. And thank you very much for the panel. We covered an enormous amount of territory today. And I think, as we were talking about at the beginning, what's extraordinary right now in terms of Ukraine is just how every day, this is changing so fast. It is very hard to predict where we go next.
It doesn't mean that it'll be over quick.
No, I think that's right. Stuart.
No, I agree with that. I'm afraid to say the government is right when they say that this will get worse.
Well, that is it for today. My colleague Alex Forsyth will be back at 11:15 tomorrow with more on Politics Live.